Quick word from me, it's day 11 in the war in Ukraine. Russian forces have surrounded several major cities like Kyiv and Mariupol. They've begun indiscriminately shelling civilian buildings. In the occupied city of Kherson, Ukrainian civilians continue to protest and show defiance against the occupiers. I understand their fear. They're now behind enemy lines. They're essentially in Russia, a country in which simply calling this war a war will get you 15 years in prison. So my thoughts go out to all of the Ukrainians fighting for their lives, and also to all the Russians who have decided to fight against the regime and protest against Putin. My thoughts also go out to my high school friend Lubomir, who I played football with. He just crossed over the Ukrainian-Polish border a day ago. He'd been collecting armor, helmets, and med kits in the United States for his people, and now he's enlisted into the Ukrainian Territorial Defense Force. He's not alone. As of Saturday, more than 66,000 Ukrainians have returned from abroad to enlist, joining the millions of Ukrainians already fighting against Putin's regime. Most of them are entering a dangerous war zone without adequate protection, no body armor, no ballistic helmets. In cities like Mariupol, where the fighting is the hardest, they've run out of food, water, heat, and electricity in many areas. Now, Putin said this was a war to liberate Ukraine from Nazis. He said that the Ukrainians would run out into the streets and greet him, but clearly the Ukrainians are running out into the streets, and they've decided to stay and fight and give their lives if need be. I guess now it's just up to Putin to realize he's made a terrible mistake. There really can't be a victory in Ukraine right now for Russian forces. It can only be death and destruction and a huge loss of civilian life and destabilization of the entire region. So if you guys want to support the Ukrainian cause and help out the civilians, please check out in the description down below. I've listed several different charities. If you can donate, that's perfectly fine. If you have any Ukrainian friends or coworkers, maybe check up on them, see how they're doing, see if they need any help. Basically, just let them know that they're not alone while they're struggling through this horrific attack on their country. So those are just a few ways to help. And remember, guys, you're not just representing your nation at this point. You're not an American helping or a Polish person helping. You are a human being helping fellow human beings, because Putin has declared a war against essentially the world by carrying out this action. We all reject this. Our generation, the ones who are young, who did not choose these leaders, fucking reject this.
Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Recently, one of our fans, Rogue, sent us this interesting question about the Confederacy of Independent Systems manufacturing capabilities and what would happen if it took over and ran the entire Star Wars galaxy. Thanks for the question, Rogue. Let's take a look. The Confederacy of Independent Systems is often derided by its critics as a fake movement created by Sith cultists to destabilize the Galactic Republic. Whereas the defenders of the CIS say that this government was created in response to the corruption and lack of effectiveness of the Galactic Republic. Who's telling the truth? Well, just like in real life, this is not some black or white situation. I would argue that both of these statements about the Confederacy of Independent Systems are true. You see, after the 7th Battle of Ruusan, the sole surviving Sith Lord in the galaxy, Darth Bane, went underground and began the practice known as the Rule of Two. Bane realized that the Sith, despite being a lot cooler and more powerful in individual combat versus the Jedi, would oftentimes self-destruct and begin to turn on one another once their enemies, the Jedi, were defeated. Bane concluded that the Sith must fight the Jedi from the shadows and keep their numbers limited to a master and an apprentice. Regardless of what you might think about the Rule of Two and whether it strategically made sense, ultimately, the Rule of Two would be the Sith's main belief system for over 1,000 years. Finally, just a few decades before the Clone Wars started, two Sith known as Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious began carrying out the final leg of the Grand Sith Plan. You see, Darth Plagueis, as the heir to a long line of Rule of Two Sith Lords, inherited a great amount of wealth. This wealth was stored in his financial lobby group known as Damask Holdings. Plagueis and Darth Sidious began using their financial power to test the Republic and the Jedi. At the time, the Galactic Republic was at the tail end of a golden age known as the High Republic period. The central government had quite a lot of support throughout the galaxy during this time period. They built some very visible infrastructure projects in the Outer Rim to finally bring peace, stability, and service to this often neglected part of the galaxy. This was seen by most observers of the Republic as a very positive move, although critics would say that this move should have been made a long time ago. Most Outer Rim planets belonged to the Republic but did not enjoy the status of full membership within the Republic. Also, many of these worlds were abiding by the Republic's trade and economic regulations, and also paying taxes, but receiving almost nothing in return. The fact that the Republic lacked a standing military or any kind of security force and basically left the Outer Rim to be, raided constantly by bandits and criminal gangs really hurt the Republic's image and made many Outer Rim member worlds dubious of the core world members. This would be the beginning of a split that would further be exacerbated during the Clone Wars, which essentially was a civil war. So Darth Plagueis would take all of those funds he collected from all of those Sith Lords for 1,000 years, and he would start funding dissidents and create tension in the Outer Rim. He would sponsor extremist groups and basically create chaos and try to kill as many Jedi as he could indirectly. You had the Yanchuri uprising of 33 BBY, for instance. The Yanchuri were a warrior race of reptiles who had been manipulated by the Sith to attack neighboring planets. It's basically what the Sith did to the Mandalorians and basically any other warrior race. They really can take advantage of people's more toxic tendencies. Darth Sidious and Plagueis had originally considered the Yanchuri reptiles as a template for their clone army, but deemed them to be far too aggressive and uncontrollable. Which is saying a lot because these guys are Sith Lords, after all. Ultimately, the Yanchuri's attack was halted by the Jedi, but not before they did considerable damage to the Republic's image. The Stark Hyperspace War of 44 BBY was another conflict stirred up by the Sith duo, as was the illegal blockade of Naboo by the Trade Federation. These conflicts successfully degraded the Republic's image and made many Outer Rim worlds wonder why they were paying taxes to the Republic in the first place. And so, when the Confederacy of Independent Systems were established by the charismatic Count Dooku, several Outer Rim worlds immediately signed up, citing previous grievances. The other half of the Confederacy of Independent Systems would be made up of a collection of industrialist corporations and other, business interests. They had first been lured to the Outer Rim by the promise of a tax-free trade zone. These corporations, like the Trade Federation, banking clans, and Techno Union, exploited this business-friendly environment and built up a huge amount of influence. As a result, overnight manufacturing basically moved from the core region to the Outer Rim as a result. Eventually, though, the Republic started noticing all of the profit that these companies were making, profit that's untaxed, and so they levied a tax and got rid of that free trade zone, which is one of the reasons why the Clone Wars started. Now, as a confederacy of independent systems, you might assume that the Separatist Alliance was a very decentralized government system. You would imagine that most of the power within the system would fall into the hands of the individual member states, and you would see a much weaker executive branch, if one even exists, and a much weaker central government. Well, it's kind of true and it's kind of not true, which is why you should never generalize anything. Take everything individually, or else you will make mistakes. I do it all the time. You see, you have the Executive Separatist Council, which is a governing body that advises and supposedly balances out the executive branch. But these so-called council members were not elected. Instead, they represented the various Outer Rim corporate interests that funded the Separatist Alliance. Literally every member of the Separatist Council represented a corporate interest. There were no other member worlds that were allowed to basically sit on this council. And even so, this executive council didn't have that much power when compared to the head of state, Count Dooku. Count Dooku essentially ran the CIS with an iron fist. As a matter of fact, there are many similarities between Palpatine's actions as the Chancellor of the Republic and the head of state Dooku. For instance, Count Dooku was also given broad emergency wartime powers that overrode the constitution of the CIS and also overrode the power of the Parliament. This is very similar to the powers granted to Palpatine by Jar Jar Binks before the Clone Wars began. Then you have the Separatist Parliament, which was really just an ineffective legislative branch that was completely overshadowed by Count Dooku. On top of that, the Separatist Parliament would divide itself into three warring factions almost immediately after its foundation, which made it very hard for anything to get passed. The Separatist Alliance would also continue the troubling policy of giving corporation representation and membership status. And unfortunately, these corporate interests, along with the Separatist oligarchs who ruled the Executive Council, were the real ones in charge. Other member worlds that belonged in the legislature were tolerated until they weren't. Mina Bentori, the representative of Onderon, would be assassinated by Dooku's agents after suggesting that peace talks should be held with the Republic. The Confederacy of Independent Systems was born in the crucible of warfare and conflict, and it would dissolve before it could escape that warfare and conflict. The question remains, how would it behave itself in times of peace? Well, let's remind ourselves that the CIS's goal was never to take over the entire galaxy, but to establish its own separatist faction. Even though that faction is technically built on popular support and the grievances of the Outer Rim colonies, or worlds. A closer look at the Separatist Alliance betrays its true nature as a fake puppet government designed for only one thing: the creation of this war. It's easy enough to maintain power and also keep your populace united when a large, threatening military force like the Clone Army is on your doorstep. People in these kind of situations tend to ignore domestic policy and other troubling things, like a lack of transparency or checks and balances for the executive branch. Suddenly, the faceless enemy, the Republic in this case, becomes the root of all evil, and patriotism overrides all logic and more pragmatic thinking. If the Confederacy of Independent Systems had survived the war or even forced the Republic to relinquish its control over its territories, the CIS would most likely have to deploy their noble Separatist droid army immediately across their territories to stabilize things and bring calm and peace to the region. I say calm and peace with huge imaginary quotes. The reason for this is that the only thing the CIS really wanted was control, and the only kind of service they could actually provide to the average Outer Rim planet was defense capabilities. This is really the only thing the CIS had going for it during the war. They had several industrial factory worlds and a large amount of cheap raw materials that could be transformed into a massive and affordable droid army. This droid army would immediately fill the vacuum that was left there by the Ruusan Reformation and the Republic's abandonment of the Outer Rim. The droid army was used in the short term to bring stability and peace to the Outer Rim territories, which have been lawless for centuries. But the real problem is your government can't just have a military force as its only service. I mean, sure, they had like an intelligence agency, and they even had their own separate holonet, but this was all in the name of propaganda, and this was all directly funneling support towards the war effort. These were not actually real services. As terribly inefficient as the Republic was, it still had a long history of service, and its massive bureaucratic machine did get results, eventually. It also helped facilitate trade and cultural exchange throughout the galaxy, which is a great thing. Were it not for those meddling Sith, I mean, they probably would have continued going on for several hundreds, if not thousands of years. The Confederacy of Independent Systems would most likely relinquish a significant amount of their duties eventually to the private sector, specifically to those corpos sitting on the Executive Council. Whether it be healthcare or education or security, pretty sure it would all immediately be privatized. Remember, before the free trade zone was stopped, companies like the Trade Federation and Techno Union essentially ran their own private fiefdoms in the Outer Rim, and were blatantly exploiting the civilians living in that area by price fixing and indenturing them into servitude. One of the ways they indentured them was by providing them services like healthcare and education and shelter that, of course, was completely unaffordable based on how much they were getting paid. And of course, the Republic had no watchdog groups out there, so they were basically left alone. This is what the CIS wants to return to: complete lack of regulation. And this is why I think the CIS would not really change its behavior if it took over the entire galaxy. The other curious thing is I believe that the Separatist droid army is the only military force in galactic history that actually has a chance at pacifying and securing the entire galaxy. I'm not saying it would be good for the galaxy, but I think it'd be successful. And that's because the individual droid units are so cheap that there is really no limit to how many you could deploy. And so in the numbers game, they would win. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the Confederacy of Independent Systems would not be that different from the Galactic Empire. Instead of stormtroopers, you would have battle droids. Instead of a massive nationalized military-industrial complex, you would have just crony capitalism that is designed to funnel more money into a massive military-industrial complex. I mean, how could two very drastically different government situations offer the same type of tyranny and authoritarianism? Well, it's simple. At the roots of the Galactic Empire and the CIS's philosophy is Sith ideology. And Sith ideology is one that is inundated with fear and lust for power. It's a very destructive and backwards thinking mentality that runs counter to some of the more positive ideologies created by human evolution in the last few thousand years. We're talking about beliefs in individual freedom, beliefs in human rights, in democracy, Anakin, combined with, of course, a balanced free market. We didn't just stumble upon these principles, though. These are hard-fought principles that have been slowly developed over the course of human history. We're far from solving every problem, of course, but these kind of elements make up some of the more stable governments we have here on Earth as a result. And that's because these types of government systems are the most balanced. They're designed to hear the needs of all the people and benefit the most amount of people. It's all about sharing power. It's about discussing different political ideas and respecting each other. It's also all about peaceful transitions of power from one leader to another. So whether it's the Empire or the Confederacy, it doesn't really matter what you call them or how the systems self-identify. I mean, North Korea calls itself the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and the only choice the average citizen gets there is what position they want to be in when the government comes to them. The Separatist Alliance might call itself a parliamentary democracy, but at its core, only one individual truly holds power, and so everything rides on that one individual's ability as a leader. There are no checks and balances, no real ability to stop them. Some of you might think, oh, Count Dooku will be different from Palpatine, but I highly doubt it, because people in these types of positions are highly isolated. They alone control all of the power, and therefore they'll spend their entire time in power trying to protect it from disappearing. And this is why these kind of dictators always go crazy, they always start wars, and they always have tiny penises. I'll see you next time, guys.